All right, everyone. Well, hey, and thanks so much for joining. Welcome back to Test-Driven Development in React Native. As always, I'm Josh Justice, aka Coding It Wrong, and I'm glad you're here. If you're watching on the stream or if you're watching a recording afterwards, I'm glad you're joining along. In case you haven't figured it out yet, I'm obsessed with test-driven development, and I'm having a blast trying it out on React Native and kind of going through it together. It's been really, really fun. If you're watching on the stream, please join in on the chat. Say hello, ask questions. That'd be great. I love that kind of participation. So let's take a look at where we are, and we're going to kind of start on a new adventure in our code this week. Brief note first, I will actually be out next week. I'm speaking at my first conference ever. I've never gotten a chance to talk at a conference before. But next week I'm speaking. It'll be a travel day, so I won't be here next Friday. Maybe I'll Periscope something from the conference or something. But so keep an eye on my Twitter account. But other than that, we'll see you back in 2 weeks for the next live stream. All right, so the app that we've been building together is called Opinion 8. You can get the repo here, codingitwrong/React Native TDD live stream. The links are in the notes of the episode or video down below. And this is our app. It's an app for tracking restaurants we visit, dishes we eat, and what we think of those dishes. So last week we got our state management working. So we can have separate screens with different restaurants and different dishes at them. So let's go ahead and run the test. We have our unit tests and component tests that are written with jest and enzyme. And then we have our end-to-end tests written with detox. And just so we can run through the app as we have it so far here, we'll take a look. So we can see that we're adding a new restaurant. You might be able to hear the clicking even on the stream. We're able to tap on that restaurant and add a new dish underneath it. Save it, and then last time we got that data persisting within the app so that as we leave the screen and come back to it, it's still there. We built out a data layer with MobX, and some of you may have not seen MobX before. So this week where we're going to go is persistent storage, saving the data back to a web service. So our data exists now, but it's not saved if we close and quit the app. There are local storage options where we can store things using React Native APIs locally in the app, and we may look into that as well. But we want to go ahead and straight to saving the data back to a web service like most apps are going to want to do. So I have set up an API here. This is a project I already had called Sandbox API. I wanted a simple API that there's a lot of read-only APIs you can use for testing out JSON and GraphQL and things like that, but I wanted a read-write one. And so this is one that you can sign up for an account for, and then you can there's blog posts in here that you can kind of read or create, and then I've actually, just in this past week, I've added endpoints for our restaurants and for our dishes as well. So check out Sandbox API if you want to sign up. We're using a specific format called JSON API. And it actually has a lot of the same features as GraphQL. So it has specifying the fields you want to load. It has eager loading of relationships, so you can kind of load related data at the same time. But we're not going to need to take advantage of too much of that to start out. It just kind of serves as a simple basis for a JSON API we're going to be able to use. So let's jump into the code and let's start coding it. We'll see how far we get this week. We should be able to at least get one request going. Now, traditionally, one other thing to say is that traditionally testing external interactions with external systems like web services is really tricky because, what do you test? What don't you test? A naive approach, not judgmental, but just saying like the first approach that might come to mind is, okay, let's run our tests and actually hit the external system because that gives us the greatest amount of confidence. At the same time, though, network connectivity errors, load errors on those servers can make your tests finicky, and so that can end up decreasing your confidence and not really providing any value, and even making you just question your automated tests in general. So in general, you might have maybe some manual tests that actually go out and hit the web service, or maybe a smoke test that you run manually every once in a while. But generally what's encouraged in a lot of circles is to have your end-to-end tests just test within the bounds of the application that you're currently in. And not going externally to other services. So with that, let's kind of get started. I just remembered this. One of the details about the external testing I've neglected to look back into to remember how to do it. So maybe you'll get to watch me figuring it out in real time as we go here together. So let's say for our first, this will be good. This will be good. So you could, in a non-test-driven development approach, you'd probably be tempted, like the requirement we have now is, okay, I want to get my app connecting to a web service. So I know I need to build out an API and connect to stuff, so I'm going to start wiring it all up and be good to go. But that's not a test-first approach. So instead, the approach we want to take is to think through, like, what can we do in our tests to drive out this web service behavior? And specifically, from our outside-in approach we've been taking, what can we do in our end-to-end test to require this behavior? Well, one thing we could do, and this actually will make it a bit simpler, maybe the simplest way to start out, is we can test that there's some restaurants available when the application starts. So right now, if I reload the app, when I reload the app, we start with an empty list of restaurants. So let's write a test that's going to force us to have a way to have restaurants there when we start the app out. We've got our managing restaurants spec right here. And you remember we've taken this user journey approach where we kind of walk through, as a part of just one test, we walk through a number of sequences kind of sequentially. So what we can do when the app starts is we can kind of create another function here that says await confirm initial restaurant present. It's fine. We'll just confirm that some kind of initial restaurant is present. And maybe we'll give it a name here. We'll just pass it in right here. We'll call it Burger Place. Let's say Burger Place is the place we want on the restaurant to start out. So we'll implement this function, confirm initial restaurant present. So what do we want to do? Well, we already have places in the code where we're looking for a restaurant by name, and so we can just copy this. We can paste the restaurant name parameter in here so it's passed in, and then we can say expect element by label restaurant name to be visible. Let's see why this is, I need the function keyword, of course. Async function confirm initial restaurant present. And the expect here is asynchronous. We use the await keyword. So I think that's good. And I like passing in the restaurant name here as well, because at this point we can see at our top level test, we're confirming that one restaurant's in place with this name, and then we're creating another one with this other name and a dish underneath that restaurant as well. So that just kind of communicates how all the data fits together and how it flows around explicitly. All right, so our test should fail pretty early with this, so let's just give it a try. We'll rerun our detox test, and as we often do, we pass the -r flag because we're not building anything differently. We don't need to rebuild the iOS side. We've got a failure. That's a good sign. Let's see if it's what we expect. Again, we've got that verbose detox message, but we see is cannot find UI element, and it's the element with accessibility label Burger Place. So that's great. Our end-to-end test is now asserting that our initial restaurant is going to show up. So at this point now, we can step down to a lower level into our code. Well, actually, let's start at the outer level of our code itself. So let's take a look at our restaurant list component. So in here, we are injecting our restaurant store using mobx react to make this data available to this component. And in our restaurant store here, let's see here. Yeah, so down in our render method, we extract the list of restaurants from the restaurant store. And now if we open up our restaurant store, that list of restaurants starts as an empty array. So if we wanted to take the approach, we could hard code that restaurant into the restaurant array to start out, but it is often the case in the outside-in testing approach. It can be good to write the code you wish you had. And so in that approach, we don't wish that there was a hard-coded restaurant here to start out. What we wish is that there was some way to kick off in our app somewhere the loading of restaurant data. We could do that in the restaurant list itself, but you may remember that we created the restaurant store out at the top level app of our application. And we did that to make sure that no matter what cool navigation stuff we do in the future, the same restaurant store instance will be used everywhere. So I think right at the root of this module where our app is started, we could go ahead and do it. We could say, send some kind of message, call some kind of method on restaurant store to get it to load restaurants. And I think we could just call it load restaurants. Maybe you probably don't even need the restaurant words. We could do load all, we could do load from server. I'm not sure. Let's do load all. We're loading all restaurants. So let's rerun our end-to-end test. I'm going to hide our unit tests for the moment because they're not really needed at this point. All right, so our end-to-end test ran. And I'm not sure if so we got the same error here, but we actually got a runtime error in the simulator here. Restaurant store.loadAll is not a function. So that's a function that we want, and we did in fact unit test our restaurant store. If you recall last time, we wrote it out first just to get everything wired up, and then we went back and TDD'd it afterwards. It's kind of an interesting approach. You can check that out. But because we want this store to be under unit coverage, let's go ahead and step down from the end-to-end test level to the unit test level and test this load all function, this load all method on the restaurant store. So we've got our restaurant store spec here, and so let's go ahead, we'll quit out this end-to-end test, and we'll run our tests of the individual components. All right, we've got our restaurant store here. We'll trigger a test run, we'll see it pass. All right. So we've described our constructor and described our add restaurant method. I think up here I want to describe our load all? I've already forgotten. Load all, yeah, load all. So load all is a method we want on this object. And so what do we want to do? Let's go ahead. I don't always write my test. I described before that you can have in your test sort of a arrange step where you set up the initial preconditions, an act step where you do perform some action, and then an assert step where you check the outcome. Now I don't always write my test that way. Sometimes it can be more useful to come back and do the arrange last. So we can say here, okay, store.loadAll, and then afterwards, let's say expect store restaurant's length to equal 1. And we can even just copy and paste this code from here. And we can test that restaurant 1 name is equal to Burger Place. So let's run this. This should fail, of course. And then now at the unit test level, we got a similar error. Store is not defined. Huh. That's unexpected. Oh, look what I've done. So I've done the thing here. This is one downside with using the describe and it syntax here, is that I've not actually created an it block to make a real test. It's just the describe grouping block. So let's do it loads restaurants from the API. That's a good name for the test. So let's run it again. Still says store is not defined, so what am I doing here that's not obvious? Oh yeah, down here it looks at each individual test I'm creating a restaurant store. I'll probably extract that out in a moment, but for now let's go ahead and put it there inline in the test. That's very easy to create. Actually, I am going to need it inline there. Alright, so now at the unit test level we've replicated the same error we saw at the top level. Store.loadAll is not a function. So let's follow the TDD approach to write only enough code to pass the current error. So we'll create a loadAll method. We'll rerun the test and see what happens. All right, so now the test, we're expecting the store restaurant's length to equal 1, but instead it equals 0. So let's see what we can do to implement that. I'm not going to hack this into the restaurant's array or anything like that, but I am going to do the minimum necessary within this function to pass the test until we get to a point where it's clear what we need to build. So let's just say this.restaurants.push. And do I want to put a real restaurant in there? No, let's just do an empty object. That's fine. All right. Okay, cool. So now we are checking the name of the restaurant that's returned. And instead of Burger Place, it's undefined. So now we're at the point where we want to get to a real implementation here. And now things can get a bit trickier. So we're now kind of thinking from the inside out. What does this restaurant store need to be able to implement this? Well, one common approach is to set up an API object that has kind of your pre-configured connection to your server. We're going to be using Axios, which is a really popular HTTP client. It makes it very easy to do just simple requests to servers and stuff like that. And so we can assume that this object, restaurant store, has an API available to it. And in fact, for testing purposes, what I'd like to be able to do is to have a constructor that takes the API in. This is not too typical for React apps, but it's going to be helpful for testing here. And MobX's class-based approach actually allows this, which makes it kind of nice. So let's just set this.api is equal to API. And then what we're going to do in here, this restaurant push. So assume we have an API object. What are we going to want to do? I'm going to want to make this an async function. You could just use promises as well, of course, but I want to do this. So what are we going to do? Let's say we're going to call API. And we're going to keep API as an implementation of Axios. And so it's going to just use regular HTTP gets and posts and things like that. So what are we going to do? We're going to do it's going to be a get to the server. We're not going to enter the full URL here because that's going to be configured elsewhere. And we're going to do get to restaurants. Actually, you know what? Before I do anything else, even to remind myself and also to orient you, let's take a look at Sandbox API. So on Sandbox API, this is set up in the README here. And the font's a little small on the video. Sorry about that. Let's see if I can bump it up. Yeah, that's a little better. So we're using standard OAuth 2 authentication. So there's an OAuth token endpoint. If you send your username and password, I guess my username and password are in here, so I'm not going to show you that. But if you send it and they're correct, you'll get an access token back. So this is a real access token we can use. If you're on the stream, you can use this access token right now. Otherwise, I'll probably invalidate it later. And what you can do over is when you're making requests to other endpoints, you pass it in. So there's a /restaurants endpoint. We pass in an authorization header with just bearer and a space and then that token. And then we follow the other specifications for a JSON API request. I think actually for a GET, we don't need to pass this content type. So let's just just disable that. We'll send it, and then we get this data back. There's a little complexity to JSON API's data just because it's set up to be able to handle some more complex situations. But what you can see here is we have an ID for this restaurant, and we have an attribute, the name Sushi Place. Those are the two pieces of the data that we're really going to care about at this point. But you can see we just need to make a request to /restaurants. We're also going to consider that the authorization is handled and configured at the level of the API object that's injected, so we're just going to leave that for now. So we're going to get to /restaurants, or we're going to do const response equals await API get restaurants. I'm going to reload this. Oh yeah, actually I've just reloaded it now and it doesn't error out anymore, so that's nice. All right, so we've got our response, and then with Axios, response.data should be our JSON data. And then actually, so interestingly with JSON API, that gives us the full JSON object. Then we have another data nested under there, so response.data.data. No. So that's going to be the array, and then we're going to get record 0. That's probably enough for now. So we're going to say const restaurant JSON equals response data 0. And then we're going to do const restaurant equals new restaurant. I see that we just pass in the name to the restaurant there. We're not actually using the ID yet. We may need that later, but again, for test-driven development, we're only going to do the minimum necessary. So for the new restaurant, we're going to do restaurant JSON.name. We could destructure it later if we find that we need that, but I think this will be fine for now. So we have this restaurant, and then we're going to do this restaurant's push. Oops. Oh, right, yeah, we just so happens right now we only have one restaurant, but there could be any number of them. So let's say this is restaurants JSON here, and then what we're going to do is restaurants equals restaurants JSON dot map. All right, let's write this out here. Does that look right? I gotta get my capitalization right. All right, so we have, restaurants JSON. We're taking the array returned by the web service, this array. Would have been good for me to have several restaurants in there, but that's okay. We're gonna map through it, and then for every JSON object, we're gonna turn it into and instantiate an actual restaurant class instance instead. Save that in this array, and then we're going to, let's see, I wonder if MobX will be okay with just assigning a new array to it or not. This may blow up on us, we'll see. So we'll give that a try. In fact, so even to simplify that down, we can just say this.restaurants. Let's do that. Okay, so this, no, we don't have an API yet, but this should hopefully be what's needed in the restaurant store. So let's see what happens here in our test. Expected the length to equal 1, but actually it equaled 0. You know, I'm actually surprised that nothing bigger showed up, given the fact that we haven't set an API. Interesting. And actually, I should be saying this.api here. So let's just do that. Oh, you know what? I think I know why. It's because this is now an asynchronous test here. So now let's... Oh, no. Yeah. So I probably want to make this an asynchronous test. Let's try to use async and await in here. That might help us. All right, this looks like a better error. Cannot read property get of undefined. So there is no this.api, so we can't read property get on it. So let's now change that by setting things up. So let's just create an API. And just to fix this error, we can just make it an empty object. Again, just enough to fix this error as it currently stands. We pass in an API. Now it says this API get is not a function. All right, well, we can fix that. This is maybe a smaller step than you would need to do, but we can make get function or a method on there. Let's do it. And this might be enough to satisfy some test that you have. But here, okay, so the response we're getting back, it doesn't have a data property. So at this point, Is this what I want to do? Actually, yeah, you know what? This is what I want to do. We don't need to do anything to create a fake API object to pass in here. We don't need to do anything much more sophisticated than this. So we want to create a fake API object here. We don't want to have a real Axios instance. We can just construct an object that gives us what we need and returns the values that we need. I think we need this to be an async method, though. And then we're going to return. So we need to create our own promise here because async await works with promises. Promise.resolve. And then what are we going to resolve it to? Resolve it to this object. This object needs to have a data property. And let's just do that. Async method has no await. Oh, right. Yeah, this doesn't need to be an async method because we're just returning a promise directly. All right, let's see here. Cannot read property data of null. We can see even from Jest's nice error output that it's the second data property, the second nested one that we need. And so we're going to need to put that in there. Let's create that extra data property. Again, by following these tests one at a time, we ensure that our test, following the errors one at a time, we ensure that our test is minimal. So we're only creating the minimum amount of fake object here to satisfy the test. Okay, so now there's no property map of null. So the restaurant's JSON is null. So let's actually make that an array. All right, and so now we're back to before. We got, things are working. We get store restaurant set to something, but it's length 0 instead of length 1. So let's just give it a length. Let's just put something in it. All right, so now a restaurant instance is created, but it's undefined. And if the name is undefined. And if we look back in here, we see that it's the restaurant.json.name. And that's actually incorrect. I just remembered. So looking back at our Postman data, it's not underneath this object. Name is not directly in there. It's nested under attributes. So this is something about JSON API that can feel a little bit unnecessary at first. Like, maybe I would just like my simple JSON object, thank you very much. But one of the great things about JSON API is that it prepares you for a lot of other situations, like related data, like links when you don't have the data details included. So JSON API can be great to work with, and so especially when this is all encapsulated in our own model layer, we can hide the details of JSON's format. So we're going to just call this attributes.name here, because that's the right nested path for it. And then we're going to create this under here, attributes, name, and burger place is the name that we should have. So that's a pretty nested object there, but let's see if this passes our test now. And it does. This is great. So yes, pretty complicated, but there we are. We could extract some of this to a simpler object if we wanted to, but let's just leave this like this for now. So one thing that's important to call out here is that this test has only built out the restaurant store and its load all method. It hasn't built out the API itself that we need to connect to. Another thing is that we don't know for sure that this is the correct data of the service. Like for example, if my test code assumed that there was a name nested immediately under there, and then my production code also assumed that, the test would pass just fine as well. Let me make sure they ran. Yeah, so this is not actually connecting to the web service and validating that. That's one of the downsides. That's one of the risks associated with not connecting to the web service in your real test. But there's so many downsides to connecting to the real web service that this is generally the approach that's recommended. We'll be able to check in our manual testing to make sure that it connects properly. So let's just put things back to as far as I can recall, the right format of the JSON API data. And I think we're good to go now. So let's leave it just like this. Okay, so now, make sure this test reruns. Let's actually create a commit here, because I'd like to save our progress. Now, even though I have the end-to-end testing here, I'm not going to commit that yet because we don't have that passing. So I drive my test outside in, but sometimes I'll commit inside out. So let's do that. We'll say, okay, create load all method on restaurant store. So we've created that method along with the unit test for it. So now what about the API? So we need to create a real API that's used in production, and so we can kind of wire that up. So let's go back out to the root level of our app. Instead of passing in nothing, let's import API from, I'll put it in the store directory for now, that's fine. That feels like where I've done it generally. And we'll pass it in there. So of course this is not going to work on our app if we run it because there is no, the module store API could not be found. So let's create that module. All right. So we have a store API here. So how can we test drive this class? And so what I would actually say in this case is that this is not something for you to worry about test driving. And here's why. So we've decided that the interface of our class is going to be exactly like Axios itself. So it's a class that just, you call .get on it. That's all the interface we've defined so far. And then it's going to return a promise with a then, and we haven't even specified it yet in the test, but have it throw or reject the promise if there's an error connecting to the web service. So Axios defines the interface here. And so Axios is presumably already tested. I don't know for sure. Let's check and see. There's a test folder, so that's a good sign. Let's open it up. I assume all of you using Axios would know if things were broken. So there's tests, and they've been updated 10 days ago. So I can believe that Axios is tested. So I don't need to test Axios' functionality itself. And another thing to think about is the fact that unit tests are really all about driving the internal quality of the app. Of your code. So the internal design of your class, like what interface do you have, what return values are brought back. And so this is where the phrase don't mock what you don't own, and even don't test what you don't own comes in. There's no reason to unit test code that's already unit tested in their library itself. So the way it works is for our end-to-end tests, we want to test all the way up to the boundary, the external boundary of third-party code that's interfacing with external systems. And then after that, we don't need to test anymore. So I want to put in this API class the bare minimum code necessary. I want no business logic, like no conditionals in here if I can help it, and just enough so that I don't feel any need to unit test what's in the API class at all. But I can feel totally confident because I'm using Axios and I know Axios is great. So we're not going to test API.js at all. We're going to manually test it when we run our app, but we're just going to not test it. So I think what I am going to do, just to help you visualize it and to tell you the truth, this is the order I tested it here. I'm going to write out the real implementation of API.js so we can see the app really working to prove to you and to prove to me that it's working. And then we're going to look into how we can mock that out to get our end-to-end tests to work and not really be hitting the network. We'll show that the end-to-end tests do hit the network, and then we'll show how we can take a different approach. So we're going to import, if I can type, Axios from Axios. I'll see if I can reload this again. It'll probably still blow up. All right, great. It's not red. I just didn't want you to have to be staring at the red all the time. So importing Axios from Axios. Why you got a problem with a semicolon? Okay. And so one thing you can do in Axios, you've probably done this before, but where's that? Yeah. No? Okay. Create. Yeah, here we go. You can create a new instance of Axios with custom config. You can configure the base URL, so that's what's going to allow us to be able to just pass /restaurants and not to have to pass in the whole URL. That allows us to centralize the domain name that we're using, as well as headers. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to copy and paste this. Why not? So we're going to create this export default API. And we don't need to set a timeout. Eventually, we're going to need a header to be set for writing data, but let's leave it out right now. Again, let's test drive this. Let's keep this as minimal as possible. And we'll get the base URL. So we'll copy that over from Sandbox API. And it's not at /API, it's just the root of the server. So this centralizes our configuration of the server we're going to be hitting. And then we export the API from it. And that should be all we need. Our application should work now. I may very well have done something wrong, but let's give it a try and see. So we've got our application. Yeah, interesting. This does not look like it's working. I don't see the app being updated. I wonder if this is the fact that the reactivity of MobX, we were overwriting the value of that property instead of kind of changing that array. That's probably it. So let's experiment with that to see. And this is interesting because this gets into MobX's reactivity, and just like last time, I don't have that covered by test, and I personally feel okay with that. So let's go back to store this in const restaurants, and then we're going to do something else with restaurants. Let's check our JavaScript APIs. What is the name of what I use for that? Docs. There we go. Let's just check our handy dandy. This is devdocs.io. It's really nice. Array.add push. I'm not sure what the easiest way is to add those onto there. We get the restaurant back. You know what? This is not the cleanest way, but again, this is part of the deal with testing, is you can do it one way and then do it better later. So instead of mapping, we're going to do it each here. This is so dirty. I'm sorry. Those of you who know more JavaScript than I do probably know exactly off the top of your head the better way to do this, but that's okay. You don't need to know everything at once. So with testing, you can write it one way and then you can change it up later. All right, so we're going to go through each of the restaurant JSON records that comes back, and then for each one, we're going to push it onto the restaurants array. And so I think, let's see, that should still satisfy our unit test. Let's test and see. It does. Nope, it doesn't. What happened here? This is good. This is real life. Things error out. Is it for each in this language? I do way too many programming languages, and it just hinders my knowledge so much. All right, cool. All right, cool. So our unit tests are passing, so we can have some good confidence. So let's rerun our end-to-end test now and see. I mean, not rerun our end-to-end test. Let's run it manually. Huh. This is really surprising. This is good that y'all are here for this. Restaurant store.load all. Why would this not be working? This.api. This is the real API. Let's debug things. Even in test-driven development, sometimes you still need to debug. So let's pull up Chrome. If you haven't done debugging in React Native before, it pulls things up in Chrome. And you can open your developer tools and see your console of what's happening. Aha! There we go. Possible unhanded promise rejection. Request failed with status code 401, and it's immediately obvious to me why that is. It wouldn't have to be for you, but as you play around, if you try to make a request to the service without a login, it's unauthorized. So we want to put in this authorization header. So for now, I'm just going to hard code this. We can maybe build out a login screen some other time, but we're just going to hard code in the headers here for now, and we'll just put in a do not hard code this. Probably I shouldn't even check it into version control, but this will at least get it passing for now. All right. What is this? Is line too long? Yeah, line's too long. All right, so that shouldn't affect our tests because our tests aren't testing API.js. We'll rerun. Still not working, so let's see. Still status code 401. So let's see. The network requests, I think, go out here too. Let's see. Maybe not. I guess not. Interesting. All right. So let's do some console logging here. To load all, and then after response, let's say got response. That'll help us log it out. We reload this. All right, about to load all. Yeah, and then of course we don't have we have the promise rejection. Error requests fail with status code 401. Looks like MobX is complaining about something as well, so that's really great that we pulled this up. We might be able to fix that. All right. What am I missing that's obvious here? The header is authorized. You know what? It's probably, I might be using the Axios API wrong, so let's just check and see. Right, of course. I'm surprised this even compiles. That's not, it's supposed to be an object. This ain't Swift. All right. All right, what's happening now? All right, we got a response now. All right, response.data. All right, attributes, name, sushi place. All right, so we're getting our data back now. This is good progress. So now let's check and see. Console.log, creating with name. Actually, let's just say processing JSON, and here's our restaurant JSON. Processing JSON. Attribute sushi place. So yeah, I don't know. All right, let's see here. I'm sure this is such an exciting debugging session, but this is what can happen. So we'll go ahead and pull up restaurant to a separate object anyways. Log restaurant. restaurant. It could just be MobX's reactivity that's not being updated here. So we have restaurant named sushi place. So this is really interesting. Could this be set up before the component is reactive? I think what I will do to play around with this, like let's try, maybe there's something timing related about loading this right at the start here. So I think what I'm going to try to do is instead of loading it in the app, let's load it on the restaurant list. Do we have a component did mount yet? We do not. Let's create a component did mount, and we'll do restaurant store dot load all. So now this happens once the component is already there and wired up. That might help. So we'll see. Let's save it. Let's reload it. This is very strange. See, this is what happens when you don't do a test run beforehand. All right. Well, let's make sure other things are still reactive. Oh, interesting. Interesting. Check it out. The screen was there, but when I clicked new restaurant, that's when it updated. This should seem familiar from last time with our issues with things not being reactive and not working out quite right with MobX. So let's think through why that is. So we have restaurant store. You remember we had to take the restaurants and call slice on it so that the render method would know that that restaurant was being used to go through there. Wonder if there's something about the reactivity. There was something that I found before in doing research this past week about why we didn't need a lot of this stuff on our code. Restaurant.push should be fine. It was fine down there. Should be fine up there. Let's read through MobX real quick. And in fact, I had a set of links with some tags on MobX. Flat list does not react to MobX observable data. Render call action not found there. Slice. Understanding what MobX reacts to. So yeah, so this, I mean, honestly, this is arguments for other approaches. Like MobX is magic and most of the time works just great, but sometimes something is not quite right and it can lead to some troubleshooting. Let's check on arrays here. Observable, pass an array to observable. This works recursively. Built-in functions. Array.slice. Interesting. Is it related to the fact that it's asynchronous? Let's see here. Async. Maybe we can tell this to be an asynchronous function, so this should wait for that to return. No, that didn't. This is very fascinating. All right, well, reactivity, man. Restaurant store. Let's go cheat and look at a different version of the app that I've done. There's so much cheating to be done. This is in Learn TDD. No, it's not in Learn TDD. It should be in the repository called Opinion 8. Let's see what I did. I don't think I ran across this the last time I test drove out this functionality. I'm happy for y'all to see the messy side of things. Action? Record, new restaurant. This dot restaurant is equal, so we're just assigning it directly there. Could it be the fact that we call it with action on it? It might be. I felt like actions were described as generally not needed. But let's try action on here, and then we could try action bound afterwards. Yeah, still not. All right, well, so let's see in this version of the app how where we wire that up. Source, components, app. Yeah, we just load all right at the top there. That's really interesting. All right, so well, let's clear this out because that'll be simpler not to have that in here. Restaurant store.load all. And let's just see what else is or isn't different. I mean, our end-to-end test is definitely not going to pass until this is done. All right, we have a provider with restaurant store. That makes sense. Restaurant list. Oh, we have a bit of a different naming in this version of the app. We've got a restaurant screen. You know what? It might be that error I see. It says MobX Observer. You're trying to use Observer on a component that already has inject. Please apply Observer before applying inject. Which, interestingly, because of the order that decorators are applied in, it actually would go to the right. I see that in my existing code, it was to the right. So let's give that a try. There we go, it loaded. Sweet. All right, so I want to roll back some of the changes we made. This is a great technique that I've learned where I work at Big Nerd Ranch. You know, we've gotten something working, but we made a number of different changes to troubleshoot. So let's go back to those and remove things that aren't necessary, or try them. So let's see here. There's our test. There's our setup in there. This change was necessary. We know that's needed. Let's see if we don't need action on here. And I don't think we do. We could look into that if we do a series on MobX sometime. All right, it looks like we don't need the action. So that's nice. Let's look at that diff again. We got our test, our reordering there, and then we got our log statement. So we can actually remove those and see how simple we can get this. All right. This is great. Learn a little troubleshooting together. All right, it still works. And now we did a for each here, but it seemed like that wasn't necessary. So let's switch this back to a map. It's assigned to this.restaurants. And from what I've learned this past week about MobX, that makes sense. Let's return new restaurant out of here and make sure that it works. And now that it is working, what we can do is just change this, if we want to not be a block, but just to be an inline arrow function. All right, it's there. It's good to go. So let's review our diff again and see if we made the simplest possible changes. And we have. All right, so let's check out. So things are working. So let's check out our end-to-end test here and see if it now passes. So remember, we are trying to, well, there's something different about the name. So we'll probably see it fail. But this will be a good illustration of wiring things up. So our app works to load the initial data in production now. But when we look at our test here, it's still erroring out saying it can't find burger place. And this is because we're providing different data. So what do we want to do? Like, we don't want to be, this is connecting to our real API and bring back the real data. And just coincidentally, thankfully, I entered different data in here. So if I change it, I could go in here and change this. This is the real API that I use. Or even if it was a dev or test instance, this is now an external system that my application's automated tests are relying on to see if they pass or not. And that's really fragile. So instead, what we want to do is to not be dependent on external systems. But let's go ahead and check these changes in. We'll say get app working against real API. And now we want to do a test API. We want all of our app to work with our end-to-end tests coming together, but just end-to-end test the application layer and fake out the API. So there are some tools to fake out HTTP requests and responses, but we've actually got a really nice seam here. We've created an API following a standard kind of interface for Axios here, and we have a really convenient way where we inject it here at the top level of our application. And so we can actually set up our app to use a test version of the API when we're in test mode. Now, this is the thing that I forgot to look up. So we're going to be going into cheater mode again and looking into the existing content to see how I did this before. So I'll just go through here to get the reminder. So one thing is, I do remember that there's a new package, and the package is React Native config. So let's pull that up and take a look at React Native config. I Googled around for this and found it. This exposes config variables to your JavaScript code in React Native. This allows us to create a file called .env, which is used in a lot of different systems, where you can have configurations like the API URL and API keys and stuff like that. And one good benefit of this is that these things now you don't have to commit them to your source code. But another advantage is you can set these up to run differently in different environments. And so that's what we're going to be doing. So before I do anything else, I am going to kind of quit out of everything, and I am going to install. We'll just leave that up there. I'll scale this over so we just don't have to look at that. Good times. I'm going to get the install running now. yarn add react native config, just in case that runs along. So let's see what else we have going on here in the application. All right. We'll come back to this in a minute. Let's get it working just with the current setup of the code. So oftentimes in my code, I'll set up an env.example file here that is actually committed to the source code. So I'm going to say, an env example file that is actually committed to version control. So this should be at the root level of our application, and there it is. And so we're just going to call this API URL. I think here, because this is the real production, well, just for the sake of example, I'll show you like, hey, here's the example API URL you want to use. Then we'll create a real env file. We're going to put the URL that we want to use in there. But we're going to update our git ignore to not commit this file. And so we can see here as we look at our changes, env.example will be committed that has fake data, but our real env file with real data will not be committed. So that's nice. All right, so let's see how we use this then. So React Native config reads the .env file by default, and so then I believe what happens is in the API index, yeah, we import env from React Native config. This is not going to look quite like that file for a reason we'll see in a moment. Yeah, env. Yeah, again, I will explain some of how this is working in a moment. API URL. And let's just make sure the format is just the same. Yeah. Okay, so now we've removed, again, this token is going to be removed. In fact, we can go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and move the auth token over there. Oops, this file is not right. Even though it's just temporary, move auth token into here. And that'll be great just so we don't accidentally commit it. We'll do string interpolation here. So now our URL and our auth token are in our env file and the example. Here, a little sample auth token. So that should be in there. So now this stuff, we haven't gotten our test working yet, but like we're at least gotten React Native config, we should have gotten it working. So let's give it a try. Let's zoom back over to here. Let's restart the packager. That could actually take a little while we're doing it. All right. So once this starts up, we should be able to manually start up our app, and it should be connecting to the real server just fine. So in the meantime, I'm going to get some other stuff started over here. I guess I better not create that folder, though. Need to do my little thing and force quit my virus software again to get this working well. Don't tell anyone I said that. Even the force quit is not force quitting now. Okay, there it goes. All right, so it should be up. We can reload this. I don't think we should need to reinstall on iOS. Let's see. It's rebundling. And then something has not worked. You know what? I think we do. I think we need to reinstall it because we have this new env file that's going to be included. So let's redo a build, and while this is running, we'll kind of set up something else. I guess this could take a little while. So sorry about not getting that installed in advance. So the next thing we're going to do is, now that this is configured in this file, what we're going to do is we're going to have a different config file for testing purposes. So let's go ahead and set that up along here. So here we see an env.detox file that sets up a different API driver. So let's create that. API driver fake. And let's see what's in our real file, an example file. So in our real file, we want to have API driver remote, and same in our example file as well. So the idea is this is a config that says whether we should connect to the real remote API or whether we should be using a local fake one instead. All right. I don't want to interrupt this from building here, but let's go ahead and create a file, fake API.js. We can just copy this over from here to refresh my memory. I'm going force quit that. No, virus control is not causing any problems here, so that's good. So check this out. This is just kind of like in our unit test, this is a fake API that has just some very, very simple data. So we create an object. It has a get that returns a resolved promise, and in there we're returning data. In that version of the app, we just returned an empty array, but for our test purposes here, let's create an object. It's going to have an attributes, and it's going to have a name of burger place. Again, this is just a fake file that's used for all of our test application. And it's just going to provide some initial data. So this is when we're in test mode, we should be hitting this fake API, getting this hard-coded data back, and we should be good to go. All right. I'm going to, just while this is rebuilding, I'm going to reload just to ensure that this is not working, and it's not. All right. So that's the fake API. That's the real API. We are going to ultimately put these in a folder together. So you see here we have an API folder that has an index file. This index file switches between the two different modes by checking the API driver value. Okay, this has succeeded, so we'll come back to that. We're kind of multitasking here. We're talking about the future while getting ready for the present. It's an interesting way to think about it. So let's see if I've gotten this working right. All right, well, that's aired out right now, but that's okay. Let's check here. React Native run iOS. Let's just do a regular run on here and see if that comes up okay. I'll also check React Native config docs. Read variables, different environments, and scheme per environment. React Native link. That was something we needed to do. So that's going to set up the build to copy stuff over. It's always a good idea to read the docs. So let's read the docs. Actually, I don't need to close yarn start, but I can do this. So React Native link is something when you're installing a library that has some native connections. React Native link is going to update your iOS project and update your Android project to do it, to kind of get those connections that are needed. So we'll run this and we'll see if we can go a little long if we need to get to the point where we are connecting to real code. Let's kill that virus scanner. I want to execute this remote code on my machine. Don't prevent me from doing that. All right, so after that, I think we're probably going to need to detox build again. All right, so let's continue to set up the eventual code as we're going to need it by copying this over. That'll be a good use of time. So this is going to be our new API file. Because it's at index.js, when we just import /API, it's going to import this instead. And what this is going to do is going to allow us to read React Native config. It's going to pull in the fake and the remote API versions, and it's going to switch based on the API driver. So if it's fake, we use the fake one. If it's remote, we use the remote one, and we return it regardless. Oh, it looks like our build is already done. All right, let's pull this up. Let's see if we got it working finally. This is why it's good to just change one thing at a time. Again, I'm kind of working ahead at something in the code, but in the code that's actually being accessed, the only change we made is pulling in data from a config file. And I'll actually do that as a separate commit so we can see that. All right, we're bundling that JavaScript. Bundle it up. All right, okay, so our test failed. That's fine. That's kind of in progress. But we can see here that our app is connecting. So let's commit some of our changes here that are necessary. Actually, let's do this. So there's changes in the Android folder and changes in the iOS folder. So those are necessary. That's what React Native built in. Package JSON. We added React Native config, so that's good. Yarn, it's just changes. That's fine. Git ignore. We want to go ahead and ignore that env file, so that's great. And then we want to add the env example. Well, let's not. Oh yeah, and then this file here too. It's the API file. So these changes. This is the changes that we made. Where we import the env, we read the base URL and the token from there. I think this token is in our Git history. I'll be sure to invalidate it afterwards. But that's enough for this commit. Read API config from env file. So that's good. So now we can switch over to the stuff that I've been confusingly coding while we've been waiting here. So let's do it. We create a folder called API, and then this now becomes the index file in there. Index.js. Fake API becomes fake, and API goes in here, and this is the remote API. So now we can walk through this in a bit more of a sane way. So when we require, in the app, when we require store/API, that's now a folder, and so the index file will be required. In here, we check the env configuration, and we return either the fake or the remote one. The remote one is the API we've already had. That to-do can go now because that hard coding is gone. And the fake one returns this fake version. So I think, so now we should not need to redo anything. We should be able to just reload. So let's reload, make sure it's still working. No. Requiring unknown module 758. That's interesting. I'm not sure what that is. So let's fail to load bundle. Let's rerun yarn start. Something got out of sync there. So we'll let that go. There's been a lot of red on the screen this time. That's what happens when you install new modules. Things get dangerous. Let's kill that virus scan. Load. Comes up the sushi place. Okay, and so just to see and confirm that this is happening right, let's break the remote connection here and say the URL is example.com. Now let's go to my site, just so we're not sending my credentials to somebody else. So now it breaks. We can see the error message in here. Promise rejection. So that confirms that we are really using this file. So I think we may actually be able to slide in the faking of the API in the test here. Let's see if we can do it. So what's remaining is env detox we've set up. We don't actually need API URL and auth token because those are only used by the real remote connection, not by the fake one. So now what we need to do, and let's look at my existing code here to see. I believe there's a parameter that we pass to detox. There's probably different ways to do it, but one thing we can do is set the environment variable env file. And so we do that in the build configuration in package.json. So that's going to pass that env file to our detox test. And this is the build command, not the run command. So I believe we are going to need to detox build again to get that environment variable passed, and that's going to build it in the proper way. I haven't played around with it too much, but I think that env file is actually copied over. I think it may not be packaged up by the packager. It may be included in the build. So I think you may need to, oops, I just did detox build. I guess I better make sure it succeeds. So I think if you change this setup or even change a value in env.detox, you may need to redo a build. And then again, this is the part where we do detox test instead of -r. -r just reloads it, but detox test will reinstall the built file, and that'll ensure that we have our env file included as well. And so I think it got past that step. I think we saw Burger Place there. So let's check and see. In our fake API, there is Burger Place. And in our real API, there is not Burger Place, there's something else. The whole thing is passing. Our end-to-end test, we're really sliding in right at that 1 hour mark here. Our end-to-end test is confirming that it starts with a restaurant. It starts with Burger Place. And that's good. So now, we have not been, so far I've just been playing around, reloading the app when it's running in test mode, and we can see there that it starts out with Burger Place. But we can also do React Native run iOS. That might or might not run with a separate build. I'm not sure. We'll test this out and see. I'm going to summarize while we're doing this. We'll see if this succeeds. Worst case scenario, you can always just kind of redo a build. You might need to switch between testing mode and running in real production mode. But let's talk about what we did. So first of all, we created this end-to-end test that would drive us to need to have some kind of initial data present. we went into our app and decided that what we wanted was a restaurant store.loadAll function. So at that point, we needed to step down to a unit testing level to test out the restaurant store. So we created a loadAll function. We decided we wanted to pass in an API into the restaurant store, and so we were able to create a fake one inline in this test that allowed us to specify whatever data we wanted here. So we got that passing, and then we needed to hook it up to the rest of our app. And so at that point, we were doing some manual testing. We got the manual testing working, hooking to a real foreign API. But then to avoid having to hit a real API and having the instability from that, what we did instead was that we created two different versions of the API. And we used React Native config to be able to set up these config files. One that in regular running mode is going to hit the remote API with this configuration value. And one that's in detox mode that's going to hit a fake API driver instead. We had an API file that just switched between the two of those for which to return. And the fake one, again, was just kind of the simplest possible object. Well, we need to expand it later, but it's the simplest possible object for now that passes the tests, that just acts with the same API. Our end-to-end tests now pass through all the layers of our app, including running actual real React Native as well, but they don't hit the API. And they don't hit the external web service, and they also don't hit our real remote API class. But we're okay with that, because there's actually none of our own code in here. Per se, there's our own configuration where we're configuring Axios. But we're trusting that Axios works the way it does. And we do our own end-to-end manual testing to make sure we're hitting the real API. That's what we're about to run right now and pull up. Let me just make sure that my pair here for my next meeting, still streaming. All right, so this build is just about done. We've squeaked in just after the 1 hour mark. So this has come up on here. You can see this is actually a separate simulator just because of by virtue of the way that I set up things in the app. I had the test going against iPhone 8, but in run mode, it's going against iPhone 6. And yeah, network error. So let's run this against the debugger. Network error. Yeah, so something here is not set up right. So I'll get that set up offline and get it going. But the idea is that, yeah, like in our end-to-end test, we were able to run against as much of the app as possible without going out to those external services. So that's our testing of web services. We unit tested our application code that connected to an API, and we hooked up the whole app together, but we faked out the API, both at the unit test and end-to-end test level. And that's how you can hook up to an external service. Next time we'll do some more work in there. We'll probably go ahead into saving changes to the remote API as well to round out this integration with the API. Thanks so much for joining on the stream. Oh, not next week. Next week I will be out because I'll be at the conference. But the week after we'll be back and we'll wrap this up. Hey, thanks for joining so much. Chat with me on Twitter at coding.wrong. Let's talk about testing, what you're doing in React Native testing, what you're working on. And we'll see you next time. Later. Now let's go to the slide. See ya.